English translation, 732nd contact. Monday, the 2nd of March 2020, 22:03 hours.
Here I am, Edward, my friend, to answer you as Njana reported to you. She told me that regarding the corona pandemic, Bernadette and you have written an information sheet that you will disseminate to all members, which is why I said I will come here and possibly contribute.
Yes, Elizabeth faxed me an email from AB asking me to give some answers regarding the corona pandemic. Consequently, I gave Bernadette some information, which you and I talked about the other day. Now what she wrote is this, which you can read and then maybe we can elaborate together, by which I mean you could add more information and I would write it down right away. Your information is probably more important than the nonsense being spouted by our Earthling experts.
These experts, as you call them in a justifiably reproachful tone, are all persons who in their offices should bear the greatest responsibility for the populations of all states, but are absolutely incapable and irresponsible for their task and for the fulfillment of their duty, as I already explained in our conversation on the 6th of January.
Good, then we can start right away. But I have another question from someone. Namely whether vitamin C strengthens the immune system and prevents infections, which I know is not the case, but you can answer it later. And if you now want to explain something more in detail about this list of questions here, which will certainly take some time, then that would be good.
Yes, to explain everything will take some time, because I see that there is a lot to complete and also to add to these explanations, whereby I can also expect your help with what Bernadette has written down according to your instructions. You have already sent the whole, but it will be necessary for me to add a few things to complete it, so that later you can replace the whole of what has already been sent with what will now be added.
Of course, if you think.
So we begin.
News on the coronavirus, and what is sensible to be aware of all the following information and advice is in accordance with the explanations and statements by the Plejaren Ptaah for your information.
It was not until September 2002 that the disease SARS emerged in the southern Chinese province of Guangdong, which had not been known until then. The pathogen of the disease, however, did not have any parasites that can multiply in host cells, such as mycoplasma or tiny bacteria from the class of mollicutes, which live aerobically to facultatively anaerobically, and also no tiny chlamydiaceae or gram-negative bacteria, which means that there was no bacterial infection, but a viral infection. So it was not such pathogens that cause atypical pneumonia, but a virus. Consequently, antibiotics were not effective in the sick, which led to many deaths within 2 years, which were officially stated to be slightly more than 1,000, but in reality were much more. The unknown virus was then defined as a coronavirus of the genus Coronaviridae, which mutated in a secret research laboratory from a pathogen of a flying mammal or a horseshoe bat Rhinolophidae, although it is claimed that the origin of the pathogen is unknown but may have been transmitted by bats. This virus was then called SARS-associated coronavirus SARS-CoV, but for short, simply SARS or severe acute respiratory syndrome. Effectively, it was not a simple disease but an epidemic, which was then also called the SARS pandemic. The pathogen was predominantly transmitted by direct or indirect droplet infection, that is to say by respiratory droplet breath or by expiratory droplets, aerosols. First, when speaking, moisture is emitted from the mouth and also through the nose as very fine droplet breath, as expiratory droplets or aerosols. During this process, the breath air from the mouth and nose becomes visible, but only on cold days, not on warm days. However, this emission has the property that this droplet breath usually expands to about half a meter when cold, and is consequently inhaled by speaking partners standing close to the person speaking, leading in this way to droplet breath infections. Second, on cold days, the breath expelled from the mouth condenses, And so the droplet breath or expiratory droplet breath becomes visible and appears in the air like small clouds of mist from the mouth and nose. Third, condensing droplet breath does not only occur in human beings but also in animals and certain creatures. Fourth, in the process of droplet breath, which, as explained, can only be seen on cold days, not on warm days. It should be noted, however, that it is also expelled from the mouth at warm times when speaking and is consequently inhaled by nearby persons. Fifth, the droplet breath of human beings, which must be mentioned again, is always visible when the moist, warm air breath expulsion from the mouth and nose meets cold and moist outside air. The reason for this is based on a physical property of air because it can only absorb a certain amount of water vapor and make it visible. Warm air also absorbs water, more so than cold air, whereby this warm air ejected from the mouth spreads further and invisibly in the warmth. In contrast to the cold, up to about 2 meters, but further depending on the wind conditions, which corresponds approximately to the outermost breathing boundary. Sixth, the droplet breath of the human being also has a weight, namely at 0 degrees a weight depending on the person and per cubic meter of approx. 4.8 grams, whereby at 30 degrees approx. 30 grams result. However, the droplet breath also saturates the air, which means that it can only absorb a limited amount of moisture from the expiratory droplets, depending on the humidity of the air. Seventh, when the droplet breath cools down more and more, the breathwater vapor changes in such a way that tiny breathwater droplets are formed, which then float in the air and spread out. Eighth, the breath that becomes visible through the cold as droplet breath is on the one hand dependent on the ambient temperature, but on the other hand also on the humidity of the air. Visible droplets can only be produced and become visible at a low temperature, and that also only if the water vapor molecules contained in the expelled breath condense so quickly that they immediately crystallize as tiny mists. Ninth, infectious contact can also occur through the coughing and sneezing of infected persons or dogs and cats, because pets can also be carriers of the coronavirus. The indirect route via contact infection or smear infection with the viruses on objects, body surfaces, food, or anything else on which infectious expiratory droplets have fallen also lead to contamination if they subsequently enter the body via the mucous membranes, for example in the mouth, nose, or possibly via the eyes. Transmission via the fecal-oral route and via other bodily excretions can also be possible, as well as via infected animals, beetles, and domestic beetle species, such as cockroaches, etc., under certain circumstances. All this is also the case with the new epidemic, contrary to many other claims and fake news that lack any reality. In addition, in the near future and in the next month of April, various freely invented factual reports will be disseminated in the public media in Europe, supposedly concerning the truth about the emergence, the becoming known, and the many alleged circumstances in China with regard to the coronavirus. In reality, however, it is all sensationalism and lies and deception by anti-China, sensationalist, conscienceless, and extremely dishonorable journalists who will incite the world population against China through their works of lies, which will lead to corresponding accusations and hate speech, threats, and denigration as early as mid-April. The whole of the beginning of this will be the European journalistic factual media reports based on lies and deception, which will cause a conspiracy and threats against China spread all over the world. You predicted the emergence of the now rampant coronavirus pandemic as early as 1995, after Quetzal also spoke of it in 1989, which was then, as usual, verifiably recorded in writing. And this prediction has become reality as usual, whereby already in the middle of the last year 2019, the first human being was infected with the coronavirus during a secret laboratory test due to carelessness and infected other human beings in Wuhan. Consequently, by the month of December, more than 240 human beings had already died due to the virus. And this was before the virus was discovered by another person who was arrested and accused of sedition, but then died himself in early February 2020 as a result of the disease. Journalistic and freely invented lie interviews and claims to the contrary. That allegedly this corona plague had already been predicted and warned of several times 10-15 years ago correspond to nothing other than fake news lies. The same applies to lies that the epidemic was recognized as early as mid-November 2019 and that China's top government and the WHO were subsequently informed. And as for a number of names of allegedly involved parties in the public health sector and officials who allegedly made efforts in administrations to mobilize the Chinese supreme government, but who allegedly did not take anything seriously and failed to take any measures to contain the epidemic. These allegations also only correspond to works of lies. These will soon lead to a worldwide vicious conspiracy theory and hatred against China and its people. When in the United States of America, the irresponsible state authorities will lie to the people and viciously denigrate China. All the emerging fake news, etc., regarding alleged early knowledge of the coronavirus disease, that it was detected very early in November 2019 and reported to the authorities as well as to the top government of China. But they collectively failed to react and take any action against the disease outbreak, is nothing but lying and conspiracy theory building fake news. The effective fact is that the Wuhan authorities only became aware of the disease on the 8th of December 2019 and then reported it to the top government, which did nothing. This alone can be blamed on the government of China for not taking the necessary measures after becoming aware of the coronavirus and its spread, thereby opening the way for the disease and encouraging the emerging pandemic. This because, as stated, it irresponsibly failed to take the necessary measures immediately to stop the spread of the disease, which was already underway. However, China's authorities and government kept the outbreak and the ongoing epidemic, which was already recognizably bound to become a pandemic at that time, secret, thus wasting the chance to still prevent the global spread of the disease. And this missed chance will now result in the next 2 months alone in what will officially be called around 3 million human beings being infected by the coronavirus worldwide, which in reality, however, will be 10.4 times more than official figures will state from the first onset of the epidemic in February 2019 until the end of April 2020. China was and is still affected. But the precursor epidemic was defined as influenza and other diseases. And consequently, as a result of the large mass of Chinese people in the billions, the epidemic was not recognized, nor was there any speculation about it. On the one hand, this is because millions of human beings die every year in the billions of Chinese human beings as a result of various illnesses and ailments, which corresponds to a normal occurrence and therefore an increase of a few 100,000 or 2 or 3 million is not noticeable. This, while on the other hand, due to ignorance of the fact of the dangerous coronavirus, false diagnoses did not allow the epidemic to be recognized. As thirdly, however, also because the government suppresses information to the outside, conceals it, and only allows it to become known when there is no longer any possibility of concealment. An action and procedure that is not only practiced in China, but in all governments of all countries on Earth. Consequently, many human beings have died from the virus, but a great many have also recovered, without anything being made public about the fact that an epidemic was already underway in China. Only through the appearance of the man infected with the coronavirus last December, who then also died, was the truth revealed and made public, Consequently, also only since then have figures been published about those infected and dead, which, however, by no means correspond to the truth, but only to officially reported figures, while there is still an undisclosed dark figure. The bulk of the whole mass of infected people in China has increased to about 27 million since February 2019. But their number has currently decreased to 2.3 million as a result of recovery, and also as a result of reasons unknown to us so far. A large number of deceased people also contributed to this. But the whole thing is already rising sharply again and will already rise to more than 5 million infected people by the middle of the year, claiming around 500,000 human lives. In particular, all Western and Southern countries will experience very high infection and death rates, especially in Europe and the Americas. China, however, will remain silent as usual, releasing only isolated, insignificant, and untruthful information. The symptoms of illness last year from the month of February onwards, as I have explained, were flu-like in the first few months, which disappeared again, but nevertheless caused a great many deaths in China, without it being recognized that it was not flu, but a corona epidemic that was spreading. At that time, however, the virus was not yet as aggressive as it has continued to develop since June and thereafter, especially from December 2019, and is now still spreading worldwide at a seriously changing rate, whereby it is still classified today by experts, sometimes irresponsibly, as a type of flu. Also, the World Health Organization, WHO, medical doctors, virologists, immunologists, specialists, general practitioners, etc., still do not recognize or even suspect that this is an imminent epidemic pandemic. While, moreover, from January of this year until the end of April, an official number of 200,000 human beings will be mentioned who will die as a result of the epidemic. Although this official number will not correspond to the truth, but according to our very accurate and precisely calculated forecast, will have to be calculated at over 51,200 more. So, the official number will only be that which will be mentioned by the authorities and the government. While the number of unreported cases worldwide will be much higher, as has been the case since the beginning of the epidemic, has remained so and will also remain so. On the one hand, this is due to inaccurate reports and registrations. On the other hand, because many governments and health authorities, etc., conceal or deliberately falsify the effective figures, and many infections and resulting deaths are also not known. This new coronavirus corresponds to a further development and mutation of the SARS epidemic, which is already spreading rapidly and widely over the earth as a pandemic, but which the majority of all irresponsible people and those incapable of their office and irresponsible people of the state leaders and the WHO still do not want to recognize and acknowledge, as well as by all health organizations of all countries, which still trivialize the whole thing and consequently do not recognize the tragedy until it will be too late, and more deaths will have to be mourned, as was already the case in Wuhan in the middle of last year, when the epidemic began and caused many deaths, but which was neither recognized nor known. Consequently, the coronavirus pandemic is rampant in all countries of the earth.
Rules to be observed.
As before, any unnecessary risk of infection should be consistently avoided, which means that all unnecessary travel for the purpose of holiday and pleasure, etc., should be refrained from. And in this respect, aircraft, ships, means of mass transport, and gatherings of people of any kind should be avoided wherever possible. The motto for health and safety is, it is better to stay at home and avoid contact with the outside world, as well as not organizing family events such as birthday parties, etc., than to expose oneself to the risk of infection, or, in the case of an already existing infection, to spread the viruses wildly in the area and thus infect other human beings aimlessly.
How an infection with coronaviruses manifests itself, or what symptoms show up, for example, when COVID-19 becomes acute.
An infection with the coronavirus is not immediately recognizable for infected persons, since the incubation period until the outbreak of the disease, contrary to false declarations of earthly physicians, is not only 2 weeks, but between 2 and 4 weeks and, according to the Plejaren, under certain circumstances even up to 3 months, depending on the strength of the immune system as well as special other factors of the infected person, which can be extremely different. If the COVID-19 disease breaks out, the first symptoms are usually a slight scratching in the throat, which initially triggers a slight coughing impulse, which leads to coughing and then later to coughing. Then fluctuating fever also occurs, which means that the fever is sometimes higher and sometimes lower, as well as a general feeling of malaise or loss of taste. And as soon as the symptoms become more severe, shortness of breath can also occur, as well as other symptoms that have, for example, flu-like characteristics. However, COVID-19 does not correspond to influenza or flu symptoms such as aching limbs, etc., and is also not associated with a common cold with a runny or blocked nose and runny nose.
Why are Europeans, and not just Asians or members of the white races, are becoming increasingly ill with COVID-19?
Since its appearance in the city of Wuhan, China, as a continuation of the SARS epidemic, so to speak, the coronavirus has changed a lot in its behavior and mode of action. It has become significantly more aggressive and therefore spreads much faster and more strongly among older human beings with a weakened immune system than among younger human beings with a stronger immune system, also in Europe. But this will change quickly. So the disease will also spread to younger human beings, causing over 200,000 deaths in the world within the next 2 months. Apparently, according to the Plejaren, northern Italy will be the first to be severely affected by the disease, after which the whole of Europe will not be spared. However, as the virus becomes more susceptible to infection, the currently mutating coronavirus will become more aggressive, so that the immune systems of human beings of all nations will not be spared from the pandemic.
How long will the coronavirus continue to rage, and is it to be hoped that it will retreat as soon as temperatures rise?
At the present time, it is not yet possible to predict how long the coronavirus will remain active. However, it is already clear that it is unlikely to subside as temperatures rise. Influenza and some other viruses react sensitively to warmer outside temperatures and therefore tend to retreat in the spring and summer months. That is to say, they become largely inactive. In the case of the coronavirus, observation speaks against this temperature dependence, since it does not only appear aggressively in colder zones of our planet, but also in Southeast Asia and, for example, Australia, and in other warm countries, where it spreads just as quickly as it does here in Europe. Consequently, it can be stated that the virus is not dependent on climate and that the risk of infection is also independent of climate. According to the assessment of the strength intensity of the coronavirus, which will be maintained in this way for a long time, it can be assumed that the virus can maintain itself for a long time and possibly for up to 2 or 3 years and cause mischief. And since the virus does not correspond to a life form, but to an organic structure, it cannot be killed but only paralyzed by a strong immune system, which must be specifically strengthened against the virus by a drug which builds up its forces. In principle, such a drug is a vaccine, but for the coronavirus it requires time-consuming research, then testing and production, which can take months or years.
By what means is the virus transmitted, and what is its duration of existence outside the human body?
There is no specific therapy against the coronavirus, which is not alive but simply exists as an organic structure. So for the time being, only special preventive measures can be taken against infection and a wave of disease. The coronavirus spreads as an expiratory droplet or droplet infection, especially through excretions of the breath and mouth, as well as through the hands and virus-infected surfaces that are frequently touched. For example, door handles, bells, bedside tables, lavatories, and other objects made of metal or plastic, etc. in the direct vicinity of a human being infected by the virus can transmit the coronavirus. On average, the coronavirus survives for up to 5 days. Although depending on the environment, it may survive longer, for example at normal room temperature and on the surfaces of various materials for up to 9 days, remaining extensively infectious. It also turns out that the existence time of the virus increases in cold and high humidity. In contrast to countless other viruses, for which the duration of existence is only known for a few, that of the coronavirus is currently known, under certain circumstances. It can also remain active outside the human body not only for a few hours, as is the case with other viruses, but for many hours and under favorable conditions for days. The virus, as explained, is spread by infected human beings through droplets, such as those emitted by humans from the mouth when coughing up and speaking, and as breath droplets from the nose. These are then transmitted over a short distance through the air to other human beings who inhale the whole thing. But how everything also settles on clothes and hands, etc., and thus infects other human beings. The virus can also settle on food, such as sliced fruit and vegetables, and on any surface where, as was said at the beginning, it remains active for a long time before finally dying down and leaving. It is therefore quite possible that the human being can become infected by touching the clothes or body of an infected human being and transferring the virus from their clothes to their own, or by eating a fruit or something else that has previously been contaminated by an infected person with a droplet release. If clothes are infected, it is not enough to hang them outdoors overnight because the virus remains active on them for a long time, but they must be washed thoroughly so that the virus can safely lose its existence. As a matter of principle, care must be taken to maintain a minimum distance of 1.5, but more correctly 2 meters or even 3 meters from other human beings. It is equally sensible not to shake hands with anyone when greeting, etc., and to wash hands regularly with a suitable natural soap if touching another human being cannot be avoided. Or if door handles or grab handles, etc., have to be touched in public spaces, for example. Instead of using public transport, it is advisable to drive your own car wherever possible, and also to disinfect door handles and steering wheel regularly. Chemical hand cleansers and chemical hand disinfectants should not be used because they are harmful to the skin and also penetrate through the pores of the hands into the organism, causing suffering and illness. It is also to be said that disinfecting the hands with chemical disinfectants is not simply harmful to health. But after a short time, if the hands are repeatedly disinfected several times a day with such toxic agents, severe disinfectant poisoning is the result, whereby the entire organism is affected. In addition to severe organic ailments and diseases, unpleasant and even dangerous dizziness, unsteadiness of walking and thought-feeling psychological disorders can result, as well as nausea and visual impairments, neurological diseases and behavioral disorders, etc., which can possibly last a lifetime.
What is the best way to support one's own immune system, can prevent vitamin C infections and diseases, and may after recovering from coronavirus disease and immunization arise?
Simply taking extra vitamin C is not enough to keep one's immune system sufficiently active. Strengthening and supporting the immune system fundamentally requires a healthy diet that provides energy and strength, as well as good health. In addition to vitamin C, other vitamins and trace elements as well as minerals are indispensable, such as zinc, vitamin B12, vitamin E, etc., that is to say, various vital substances. It is therefore advisable, depending on the food, to go beyond a healthy and careful diet, and also to regularly take a good multivitamin preparation or individual necessary substances in at least double the dosage recommended by the manufacturers. Unfortunately, all supplements available on the free market are severely underdosed, which is also known to us, because we are also trying to gain knowledge in this respect. According to our findings, a doubly increased dosage of a multivitamin preparation is usually not only harmless, but indicated for Earth humans who do not receive enough vital substances through their normal diet. It is not possible to prevent infection by a virus by taking vitamin C and multivitamin preparations, even if such preparations strengthen the immune system and various organs and bodily functions. In principle, infection by viruses, bacteria, and all kinds of microorganisms can only be prevented by certain precautionary rules, measures, and behavior, and strict adherence to them. In principle, even the strongest immune system can fail, and that is when it is attacked by dangerous germs that trigger a shock effect and paralyze the whole system, which again corresponds to a fact that is just as unknown to the entire earthly medical sciences as it is to the fact that in certain human beings a recovery of the organism can take place with regard to the coronavirus infestation, but no immunity develops because a coma impulse develops which continues to exist despite recovery, whereby the disease can renew itself again, which however does not correspond to a reactivation, but to a continuation of the disease out of the impulse coma. That, Edward, should do the trick, but it took longer than I thought.
That is just the way it always is, because it is always like time is running out from under your fingers.
I am also familiar with that phenomenon.
Unfortunately, however, it verplampered many Earthlings.
What does that mean? I do not know that word.
It means senselessly wasting time, or as we also say, stultifying time, such as those, if I may say so, who, as stupid spectators, do not take the initiative to do something useful themselves, such as by attending senseless sporting events as mere spectators and howling frenetically primitive applause, as is the case with football, among other things, for which the fanatics still pay horrendous entrance fees. That is everyone's business, but I think that human beings should really do something useful and intelligent with their free time in order to get themselves in shape, instead of spending their time verplamper as stupid fanatic spectators who also pay admission fees. In order to understand this and also to take the initiative, to move oneself, to do useful work, to learn something, to do something valuable for oneself or for others who may need help, this requires understanding and reason. If, however, these prerequisites are lacking, then all is lost. But as I said, to each his own is what is his own, so every fool has to go through life with his own stupidity.
This is undeniably so.
Exactly, but I have a question about that. How is it with you? Do you also have such so-called professional sporting events, like the Earthlings here with us? The Earthlings who practice sport as a so-called profession because they think they are called to it, that's where the term profession comes from, are, in my opinion, work-shy people who, thanks to the stupidity of the spectators, can collect horrendous salaries and live in luxury. This, as well as the organizers, bosses and employees, etc. of the so-called clubs, who are also financed by the stupidity of the thoughtlessly paying spectators, while they themselves have to earn their income with hard work. But just the same, stupidity knows no bounds, and if a human being is addicted to it and unable to think and act logically, then he suffers damage, in this case by paying himself silly. And all this, in my opinion, is just as criminal as the criminal machinations of the grandparents' scam and other similar injustices.
No. Our folks do engage in physical education individually or in groups, but not as a main occupation or profession, as you say. As a vocation, our peoples do their physical training for their own pleasure, which also includes artistic moments, which you call artistic gymnastics, as you once said. Such performances are also exhibited by individuals or groups at public events, But this is only sporadically and never for profit, because we do not know a financial system. As for your exposition of your view concerning the work shyness of the called and the stupidity of the spectator fanatics, as you aptly call them and everything connected with it, I can quite agree with it and concur with you.
Fine, then I have won a comrade in arms in you in this respect. But you see, this is how we deviate from what I originally wanted to talk about. Basically, I wanted to ask you something about the coronavirus. Namely, to what extent protective masks should be worn, because actually only medical masks and protective goggles are effective against the virus, as against bacilli, bacteria, and other microorganisms. Although we have already discussed this matter to a large extent a month ago, I still think that a few things should be explained, because simple respiratory masks, when they cover the nose and mouth, can also prevent a lot. This is because, as you have explained, the breath and expiratory droplets as well as a moist pronunciation are not passed on, and in this way a spreading or infection to other human beings can be greatly reduced, and also in relation to one's own personality, some things can be avoided. But that does not mean that such simple protective masks would protect against viruses and bacteria, because this can only be guaranteed by special medical filter masks. So I think that we should take up again what we have discussed privately, and you should say something enlightening about it. Just also that simple masks can also offer a certain protection, but that no one should be lulled into complete safety when such masks are worn, etc. You also said some time ago that you wanted to test protective masks. Have you done that, Ptaah?
The most important things have already been explained, but I can add a few things. And regarding the testing of protective masks, we have done that, for which some things are to be explained. Basically, I first have to explain that as a rule, mouth-breathing protective masks are equivalent to disposable masks that have to be disposed of after a single use. On the other hand, it is particularly important to say that the use or wearing of protective masks is beneficial to health and life and, in the long term, reduces or completely prevents the ingestion of particles that are hazardous to health, such as fine dust of various kinds, some of which contains radioactive particles, thereby reducing the risk of suffering and illness, especially various types of cancer. We have looked around at mouth-breathing masks and have researched and tested the suitability of various freely available protective masks. In the process, we became aware of products that are divided into different classes and labeled as FFP1, FFP2, or FFP3 and are useful, but cannot be declared completely germ-proof. These are protective masks which, as half masks and full masks, are effective against fine dust and other fine particles, thus protecting the respiratory tract from dangerous aerosols or expiratory droplets and from various types of dust, for example outdoors, on roads or also in workplaces, etc. We have thoroughly tested the FFP1, FFP2, or FFP3 protective masks for their safety in terms of their usability and permeability with regard to viruses, bacteria, and microorganisms as well as fine dust, smoke, and other toxic substances, as well as the particularly important connectability to all parts of the face, especially around the eyes, the respiratory organ, and chin. Of great importance in our tests in this regard was the importance of the seal of the mask, namely the extent to which the breathing air can flow out and in at the mask connection points and introduce germs from the outside into the respiratory organ and the mouth. The filtering performance of these FFP masks is different, as is the equipment of the masks, such as the fact that the filters can have an exhalation valve, which is particularly important when breathing resistance has to be regulated as a result of material conditions. However, as far as the necessary protection against viruses, bacteria, and microorganisms is concerned, these protective masks also provide only partial or no protection against viruses, etc., although the manufacturers claim otherwise. In any case, this unsuitability applies to the products FFP1 and FFP2. The product of protection class 3 is to be judged differently. Although it does not guarantee 100% reliable protection against bacteria, microorganisms and viruses, as is the case with the currently rampant coronavirus or COVID-19, we can nevertheless recommend this protective mask as good and largely protective. F. All these three FFP masks differ particularly with regard to the purpose for which they are used. Thus, their protection is also determined according to the protective filter and its permeability. G. All three respirators tested by us correspond to suitable products, which above all provide very useful protection against aerosols based on oil and water, but are also very useful against fine dust, other types of dust as well as against smoke, and can be used in various work processes and provide reliable protection. H. The relevant respiratory protection filters of all three classes, FFP1, FFP2, or FFP3, can be used depending on the case of use and need, but the Class 3 filter, FFP3 filter, can be used largely for protection against viruses, bacteria, and microorganisms due to its good filtering properties. But depending on the coronavirus gene variation, only partial protection can be provided under certain circumstances, but generally still good or full protection. This, Edward, my friend, is once that, but there is further to be explained. 1. Normal commercial mouth-breath protective masks, which are also called mouth-nose protective masks or face masks, etc., do not protect in any way against the coronavirus, nor against bacteria and microorganisms, which also applies to self-made protective masks of all kinds and materials, such as handkerchiefs, scarves, multifunctional cloths or cleaning cloths, cuddle cloths, bibs, muzzle cloths, as well as headscarves, underlay cloths, face cloths, balaclavas and neckerchiefs, etc. too, ordinary commercial mouth-breathing masks or homemade protective. Masks of all kinds can be useful in any case against the emission of respiratory and expiratory droplets and against wet pronunciation from one side as well as from the opposite side. 3. Wearing such masks in case of contagious diseases, especially epidemics, is absolutely appropriate and necessary when dealing with other persons outside the personal living area, such as under certain circumstances in working areas as well as in public transport, department stores and in crowds, etc. 4. Normal good commercial mouth-breathing masks should always be such, as well as homemade ones, that they can be used for a long time and therefore necessarily washed with natural antibacterial agents and thus reused. It can be useful after washing them, not by machine, to spray them with a light but not chemical but natural antibacterial agent. 5. The wearing of normal commercial mouth-breathing masks or self-made protective masks against contagious diseases, especially in the case of epidemics, does not guarantee any protection against infection by dangerous viruses, bacteria, or other microorganisms, so a false feeling safe would be dangerous to health. 6. Ordinary commercial mouth-breathing masks and homemade masks of all kinds may also be useful against dust particles and the like, but never against preventing infection by dangerous germs such as viruses, bacteria, and microorganisms of all kinds. A sufficiently large distance between human beings is always the best protection against infection, but unfortunately for many people, wearing protective masks causes them to become careless and indifferent, not to adhere so strictly to the necessary precautions and therefore to become infected with the germ despite wearing a mask. 7. The wearing of mouth and respiratory protection masks against germs, especially viruses and bacteria as well as other harmful microorganisms of various kinds, requires specially manufactured medical products for this purpose, which are probably only available in specialized shops. 8. When using normal commercial mouth-breathing masks, it is to be noted, and this must be said again and again, that such masks, as well as self-made ones, do not protect against the coronavirus, nor against harmful bacteria and all kinds of microorganisms. If there is direct or too close contact with infected human beings, which is why a distance of 2 meters from such human beings is urgently required and must be maintained even if a normal or homemade mouth-breathing protective mask is worn. 9. Only specialist full-face medical masks offer effective protection against the coronavirus, as well as against various other dangerous germs. Some normal medical masks have disinfection filters but must be disposed of after use, while others are designed for multiple use and can be fitted with replaceable disinfection filters. 10. For effective real protection against the coronavirus, as well as with regard to certain other contagious germs, it is essential to also wear properly correct protective goggles when wearing suitable mouth-breathing masks. Because certain germs, especially various viruses, use the properties of moisture to take hold, while others, such as influenza viruses, like absolutely low moisture. Consequently, some are more likely to spread in dry conditions, but others in moist conditions, which is why in any case, if there is a risk of infection, not only a mouth-breathing protective mask should be worn, but also good protective goggles for the eyes. 11. The wearing of mouth-breathing masks should be observed with regard to the corona epidemic, but not unnecessarily on the street when there are no passers-by or only a few of them on the road and there is no approach to each other. But a necessary distance of at least 2 meters is kept from one human being to another. This rule, which must be observed at all costs, has no exceptions, because it is urgently and necessarily unavoidable. Because only in this way can the corona pandemic be contained and thus further infections and deaths slowly reduced and ultimately completely eliminated. But this will not be in a short time because this epidemic is persistent and will not find a definitive end so quickly. 12. In the case of those Earth humans who wear protective mouth-breathing masks as a result of the corona plague, this fact, apart from the protective function against infection, also has another important and positive aspect and effect at the same time. Namely, on the one hand, the perspective of the human beings wearing protective masks changes positively because they mentally come to terms with the danger of the corona epidemic, and consequently they voluntarily place themselves in the necessary measures that will contribute to the containment of the pandemic. B. The thought-feeling movements of the human beings wearing a protective mask have a positive effect on their psychological state and regulate their tension in an ameliorating way into a calming tolerability. C. Even if there is no efficacy of normal purchasable or self-made protective mask wearing against the coronavirus, our clarifications prove, however, that the use of such masks brings good and positive effects with regard to the aspects and affects mentioned, whereby also the resulting and the following of the important and necessary safety measures contribute a lot to the fact that the infections and thus also the deaths are gradually decreasing, which corresponds to a plausible consequence. D. The whole procedure corresponds to psychologically grasping values, which have a calming effect on the thoughts, feelings, and psyche of rational and reasonable human beings, and in this respect convey a certain sense of security, which has a positive effect on behavior and on the fact that wearing protective masks and keeping a necessary and sufficient distance from other human beings is considered normal and is observed. It is essential to take into account that human beings who are inaccessible to reason and rationality for various selfish, egoistic, and thoughtless reasons, as well as out of indignation, rise up against and fail to comply with necessary measures and ordinances that have been issued, thus causing riots and creating health hazards to the detriment of the entire community. 13, unfortunately, the protective effect of normal, simple mouth-breathing masks against the coronavirus is overestimated because, on the one hand, these normally purchased or self-manufactured masks have no protective effect against the virus and, on the other hand, Because the protective effect is generally not necessary in the open air and on the street because the virus is not transmitted through the open air, but only when persons communicate too closely with each other. 14. False recommendations by experts or those who want to be, including certain virologists, doctors and physicians, etc., that wearing normally bought or self-made simple mouth-breathing protective masks is absolutely safe and prevents infection by the coronavirus. This corresponds to a malicious or at least dangerous and reckless false claim or lie. Because fundamentally and effectively, only specialist medical protective masks can provide the necessary protection against dangerous viruses, bacteria, and microorganisms. 15. In principle, masks that can be bought or made by the patient can only prevent infection in the open air, in the countryside, on the street or elsewhere, and also only if there are no other persons in the vicinity who might be infected by contagious germs. If, however, there are infected persons in the vicinity, then a proper distance of at least 2 meters from them must be maintained. Because the types of protective masks mentioned are absolutely unsuitable as protection against infection by viruses, bacteria, and microorganisms. 16. And another time it should also be said that wearing a mouth-breathing protective mask outdoors, on roads and in the countryside is not necessary and also nonsensical if there are no other human beings all around or, if there are human beings, a sufficiently large distance can be maintained. The certainty that no infection will occur in the open or on the street is, however, as mentioned, already due to the fact that in the open the danger of infection is not only extremely small, but practically impossible if there are no other persons present all around. Even if other persons are present, but a sufficiently large distance is kept from them and a protective mask is also worn, infection with the coronavirus can be reliably prevented and absolutely ruled out with a high degree of certainty. This fact alone makes no sense for the wearing of a mouth-breathing protective mask, that such masks would have to be worn outside as a matter of principle. They are only necessary and important to wear if there is a risk of coming into close contact with other persons. Because effectively it is only then that the wearing of mouth-breathing protective masks makes sense, as well as being important in order to protect oneself from infections. 17. If one's own person is infected with corona and a simple mouth-breathing protective mask is worn, this does not mean that other human beings can be protected from the coronavirus. Because simple protective masks that are not medically equipped in a good way cannot prevent the virus from escaping through a simple mask and being passed on through the air, so that if there is too close contact with other human beings, they can be infected. The only thing that can be prevented from escaping by unsuitable masks is breath and aerosols or expiratory droplets, which are strongly slowed down and can therefore no longer fly far away from the mask. Tiny germs, however, such as viruses, bacteria, and microorganisms, can escape unhindered from mouth and respiratory protective masks and, due to their tininess, can easily be carried away by the slightest breeze in the air up to 1.5 or 2 meters away, so that persons who are present can be infected by them. 18. It is and remains important, even when wearing normal or self-made mouth-breathing masks and in all situations, that the most important safety rules are not neglected. For example, that under all circumstances the distance between human beings and humans must be kept, and that caution is also required when dealing with mammals, which may also be carriers of the coronavirus, which has already occurred in various countries, but which is usually concealed, as is honest official information regarding the correct number of infected and dead people. This while there is also a large number of unreported cases that can never be ascertained. 19. The fact is, as is evident from our observations and findings, that the wearing of normal mouth-breathing masks tempts many people to no longer exercise the necessary caution. such as keeping the necessary distance between human beings, which in a windless closed room should be at least 1.5, but as a rule not less than 2 meters. 20. Normal non-medical mouth-breathing protective masks must be changed regularly because they become moist due to the expiratory droplets and the breathing air. Consequently, the necessary filtering function of dry exhalation is no longer guaranteed. Good protective masks can be washed with natural antibacterial soaps or other non-chemical agents and reused. 21. Many normal commercial mouth-breathing masks, as well as homemade ones, lack instructions on how to use them correctly, and it is also not explained that such masks do not provide protection against dangerous viruses, bacteria, and other microorganisms, because they do not correspond to medical masks. So that in spite of such protective masks, human beings expose themselves to the risk of infection if they come into direct or too close contact with germ-infected human beings. So it is downright negligent to rely on such mouth-breathing protective masks, which are not designed to protect against dangerous viruses and other germs, and which are only designed to protect against respiratory expectoration and the spread of expiratory droplets or aerosols. 22. Only true medical masks, as used in medical facilities such as hospitals, etc., provide real protection against dangerous pathogens such as viruses, bacteria, and other dangerous germs. In addition, suitable protective goggles are also used. Simple mouth-breathing masks are used in such facilities, but not primarily as protection against dangerous germs, but rather to prevent one's own breathing and possible coughing and the spread of expiratory droplets, as well as to protect oneself in the same way against such expectorations from patients. The purpose of these masks is therefore not to protect against viruses, but to serve a different purpose because nursing staff naturally come much closer to patients than a passerby on the street to another. The fact of the matter with such non-medical masks is that although they are somewhat better than homemade ones, all of them of course work much worse and are also useless against dangerous viruses and bacteria, even though all kinds of experts claim the opposite and recommend such products. Although effectively only professional medical protective masks can offer real protection against viruses and other dangerous germs. 23. As a rule, normally available mouth-breathing masks do not provide protection against dangerous viruses and bacteria, etc., but are designed to stop small or large expiratory droplets that are produced when coughing or speaking. In this respect, it is therefore plausible that expensive professional medical protective masks should not be used for this purpose. Furthermore, such protective masks are also not generally available in normal bourgeois shops, and moreover, if they are offered in the open market at high prices. Normally, however, normal simple mouth-breathing protective masks are already sufficient, especially designed to ward off expiratory droplets and to prevent coughing. 24. Effectively, medical protective masks, which are equipped to ward off dangerous viruses and bacteria, and which are used for specific medical purposes and also require protective goggles, should be reserved for medical personnel and corresponding nursing staff only. 25. Ordinary. Simple mouth-breathing masks do not provide protection against dangerous viruses and other germs, so there is no evidence that they are of any use. Moreover, the use of such masks can be dangerous if used incorrectly, especially if hands infected with dangerous germs inevitably and unknowingly touch the mask and become infected. And this is exactly what often happens, because people often grab at the protective masks to check their fit, correct them and put them back on the face correctly, because physical movements always cause them to move, to shift under the respiratory organ or the chin, whereby saliva, a coughing sputum, breath, or expiratory droplets can get into the mask and a smear infection can occur. 26. An oral respiratory protective mask must always be worn and treated as if it were contaminated with germs in that, if it must be removed, It should not be handled with bare hands when removed, but only with disposable gloves and removed and disposed of, after which the hands should be thoroughly cleaned with a natural soap. 27. The necessary distance from other human beings, at least 2 meters or more, is to be observed and maintained at all costs in the event of a contagious disease, epidemic or pandemic, whereby, despite the wearing of a protective mask when coughing or sneezing, this should not be done into a hand but into a suitable cloth or into the crook of the arm. 28. If mouth-breathing masks must be worn and a beard is present, then a mask must be such that, despite the hair, it closes the face well so that nothing can enter the mouth and breathing area from the outside. 29. What I also have to mention is the following. If protective masks have to be worn, as a result of human beings in the immediate or close vicinity, because they are heavily contaminated with infectious agents, then this corresponds to a situation in which disposable masks are worn and which are to be disposed of after use. Such disposable masks should only be worn with disposable gloves and should not be touched from the inside but only from the outside. The masks must also be touched correctly in such a way that they are only grasped by the rubber bands and held in front of the face, and both rubber bands are pulled behind the ears. The mask nose clip is to be adjusted on the respiratory organ by squeezing, where the mask must fit tightly all over, and then pull it down over the chin with thumb and forefinger. A. Such a protective mask must not be pulled under the chin in between and later brought back in front of the face, because if it is brought under the chin, then a new mask is required in such a case. If necessary, goggles or safety glasses are also to be worn. B. When removing such a special mask, it is necessary to hold one's breath for a short time, because any germs have settled on its surface and can cause an infection. C. Used disposable masks must be disposed of properly in an appropriate waste container after use. D. After work, hands must be washed thoroughly with a suitable soap, but never with chemical disinfectants. These are the most important and necessary facts, Edouard, that I have to state regarding your questions.
Then I think enough should really be said for today in this matter. Then we could call it a day, because I should once again sleep a little more than just 4 hours, which Evi also keeps telling me. Always walking around as a result of tiredness like a dream walker and half floating on rubber shoes, that might give me a bit of trouble sometimes.
I can understand that, but you should set your working day at a maximum of 10 and not regularly at 20 and or 21 hours.
I am afraid I cannot, but let's talk about what